March 6, 1987, 6:48 in the evening, off the coast of Zeebrugge, Belgium. The cross-channel ferry MS Herald of Free Enterprise has just left the Belgian port. She is carrying 539 people, passengers and crew, on the short crossing to Dover. She has been at sea for approximately 90 seconds. The bow doors are open, not cracked open, not slightly ajar. Open, fully open. The enormous vehicle loading doors at the front of the vessel, designed to allow cars and trucks to drive directly onto the car deck, are standing wide open as the ferry accelerates into the open sea. Water rushes in, the car deck floods, the ship develops a list. Within 90 seconds of the first water entering the hull, the Herald of Free Enterprise has capsized. 193 people die. Some drown. Some die of hypothermia in the cold water of the English Channel in March. Some survive in air pockets in the inverted hull until rescuers cut through the steel to reach them hours later. The person who was supposed to close those doors was not at his post. He was asleep. The person who was supposed to check that he had done it assumed someone else had verified it. The person on the bridge who was supposed to have confirmation before sailing had no means of receiving it, because the company had been asked by its own captains to install indicator lights on the bridge, showing the status of the bow doors, and the company had declined on the grounds that indicator lights were not necessary. The Herald of Free Enterprise disaster is not simply a story about one man forgetting to close a door. It is a story about a system designed through a series of small decisions that each seemed reasonable in isolation to make exactly this kind of disaster nearly inevitable. The Ro-Ro ferry design had been recognized as a specific safety challenge within the maritime industry since the 1960s. The open deck design, efficient, fast, and commercially competitive, created a vessel whose stability in the event of significant water ingress onto the car deck was fundamentally different from a conventional ship with watertight compartments. In a conventional compartmented ship, flooding in one section is contained by internal bulkheads. The ship might list heavily, but does not necessarily capsize rapidly. In a Ro-Ro vessel, water on the car deck is free to flow across the entire length and width of the ship without containment, and the resulting effect on stability is much faster and more severe. This physics was understood. It had been the subject of technical papers. It had contributed to several previous incidents. The specific failure mode of open bow or stern doors had been implicated in earlier accidents with different ferry operators. Townsend Thoresen, the company that operated the Herald of Free Enterprise, ran a fleet of Ro-Ro ferries, roll-on, roll-off vessels, that load vehicles through bow or stern doors directly onto open car decks. Ro-Ro ferries had transformed European short-sea shipping since the 1960s. They were fast, efficient, and commercially dominant. They were also subject to a specific and well-understood vulnerability. An open-deck vessel with a large vehicle loading door on the hull, if that door is left open or compromised at sea, has very limited resistance to progressive flooding. There are no watertight bulkheads to slow the water. The entire car deck is one open space. This was not unknown. The CB, the Al-Kahira, and several other Ro-Ro vessels had suffered flooding incidents in the decades before 1987. The specific hazard of open bow doors on a Ro-Ro ferry had been noted in maritime safety literature. Ship captains who operated these vessels understood the risk intuitively, and the captains of the Herald of Free Enterprise had, at various points, asked Townsend Thoresen to address a specific vulnerability in how they managed that risk. Their request was for indicator lights, a simple system, lights on the navigation bridge showing whether the bow and stern doors were open or closed, so the officer on the bridge could know before and during departure, whether the vessel was in a sealed condition for sea. The request was made through internal channels. In August 1986, a senior master of the company's fleet wrote a memo to management explicitly requesting the lights. In October 1986, another master raised the same issue. The company's assistant operations manager responded to one of these memos with a note suggesting that adding indicator lights to the bridge could give officers a false sense of security, and that the responsibility for ensuring doors were closed lay with the officers already assigned to that task. The request was declined on cost and management grounds. The deck department's responsibility for ensuring the bow doors were closed before departure rested in a chain of command that relied entirely on verbal confirmation and physical presence. The assistant bosun, Mark Stanley, was responsible for closing the doors. The bosun, Terry Ailing, was responsible for supervising him. The assistant bosun chief officer, Leslie Sable, was supposed to be on the car deck to visually confirm the doors were closed before returning to the bridge to tell the captain the ship was secure. On March 6, 1987, the departure from Zeebrugge was behind schedule. The ferry had arrived late from a previous crossing. The pressure to depart quickly was real. The assistant bosun Stanley had been working double shifts and was exhausted. When the call to muster for departure came over the tannoy, he was lying down. He fell asleep. The bosun, Ailing, was on the car deck and could see the doors were still open. He assumed Stanley would close them imminently. He waited a few moments, then went to his own departure station, which was not the car deck. He later testified that he had assumed someone else would close the doors or verify that they hadn't been closed. The assistant chief officer, whose job included specifically confirming the doors were secured before going to the bridge, went to the bridge. He believed the doors were closed because at the time he looked aft on the car deck, he could not see them from his position. On the bridge, the captain had no indicator light to check. He had no direct confirmation from the car deck that the bow doors were closed. He relied on the established procedure under which the presence of the assistant chief officer on the bridge was taken as implicit confirmation that all pre-departure checks, including the door status, had been completed. The assistant chief officer's presence on the bridge meant the ship was ready to sail. The Herald of Free Enterprise sailed. As the ferry accelerated to its cruising speed, the open bow doors were at water level and then below it. At approximately 8 knots, water began entering the car deck through the fully open bow doors faster than it could be dealt with. The weight of the water and its movement shifted the ship's metacentric height, its stability point, below the level needed to keep the ship upright. The list began. It became a rule. Within 90 seconds of the water first entering the car deck, the Herald of Free Enterprise lay on her side on a sandbank in approximately 30 meters of water, close enough to shore that the wreck could be seen from Zeebrugge. The survival rate in the first 90 seconds depended almost entirely on where people were. Those on the upper decks who were flung clear or were able to reach the surface quickly had the best chance. Those below decks, in cabins, in the vehicle access areas, in the cafeteria, faced flooding water and an inverted ship that turned every corridor and stairway into an obstacle in the dark. The British government's investigation, conducted by Justice Sheen, produced a report whose language was unusually direct. It concluded that the company was infected by the disease of sloppiness from top to bottom. It found that the chain of communication failures that led to the Herald of Free Enterprise sailing with open bow doors was not a random coincidence, but the predictable result of a management culture that had never created robust, closed-loop system for confirming the ship's readiness for sea. The acquittal of Townsend Thoresen and its senior managers in the corporate manslaughter proceedings was one of the clearest demonstrations of the gap in English law between what ordinary citizens understood to be obvious negligence and what the criminal law at the time could actually prosecute. The deaths of 193 people on a ferry that sank because its bow doors were open, operated by a company that had declined to install door status indicator lights that its own captains had specifically requested, could not generate a successful corporate manslaughter conviction because the company's management structure was too diffuse to satisfy the legal test. The judge in the 1990 proceedings directed the jury to acquit, finding that the prosecution had failed to establish that any individual who could be identified as the directing mind of the company had been grossly negligent. The assistant bosun who was asleep, the bosun who assumed someone else had done it, the chief officer who assumed the system had worked, none of them was the directing mind. The senior managers at Townsend Thoresen, who had declined the captain's request for indicator lights, were not on trial. The corporate entity itself could not be convicted because the law required a directing mind, and the directing mind could not be identified. The families of the dead watched this process with what many of them described as a second loss, the loss of any prospect of accountability from the legal system that had promised them one. The acquittal created a legal vacuum that advocates for the families found intolerable. There was, in the years following the Herald case, a sustained effort by legal academics, labor unions, family groups, and safety advocates to reform English corporate manslaughter law. The argument was not abstract. It was grounded specifically in cases like the Herald, where the causal chain from corporate decision to mass death was clear but unprosecutable under the existing law. The Director of Public Prosecutions in England subsequently brought charges of corporate manslaughter against Townsend Thoresen, later acquired by P&O, as well as against 7 individuals, including the captain and senior directors. The prosecution failed. English law in 1987 and 1994 required for corporate manslaughter that a specific individual at the very top of the corporate hierarchy could be identified as the directing mind behind the negligent act. The company's management structure was too diffuse, too many layers between the managing directors and the individual decisions on the car deck to satisfy that legal test. The case led directly to the Corporate Manslaughter and Corporate Homicide Act of 2007 in the United Kingdom. Legislation that specifically removed the directing mind requirement and allowed corporations to be convicted on the basis of how their organizational systems caused death, rather than requiring a single person at the top to be the cause. The indicator lights, which the company had declined to install when its captains requested them, were fitted to all ro-ro ferries in the UK fleet within months of the disaster. If you want to understand the disasters where the equipment that would have prevented it was designed, requested, costed, and rejected, subscribe. Every week, a story that was hidden in plain sight.